Hello, listeners. This is Dr. Eric Tornfelt. I am your host. This is the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. So thankful that you could join us for this latest episode of the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. This podcast is intended to help provide thought leadership and provide ideas about what it looks like to innovate schools in our country, to bring about a thriving school for every student. There's a lot of things that are wrong with our schools today, but there's also a lot of great things that are going on. And so we want to always bring about those ideas, to talk about them, and to figure out, okay, what can we do? What can each person do in their sphere of influence to help bring about a thriving school? And so today, our guest is Mr. Daniel Buck. Daniel is really a thought leader. He is leading the way in some of his ideas and his opinions. He is a full-time columnist, former English teacher who has written a book called What is Wrong with Our Schools. I encourage our listeners to check that book out. But he's also been featured in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, National Affairs, First Things, as well as the New York Post. And so he comes with a high level of credibility today. He's got great ideas. I always like listening and reading Daniel's things. And so I'm honored that he can be a guest on the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. So I hope that you enjoy this. I hope that as you listen, that you would think about your own practice wherever you are, whether you're a teacher, a principal, a superintendent, listening to this episode, that you would think about what do you agree with, what do you don't agree with, but then what can you innovate? What is the small thing that is in your work in education that you can innovate, or that you need to change or think differently about, or help others think differently about? So I hope you enjoy this next episode of the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. Daniel, thank you so much for being here. I really am so glad that we get to have a conversation today on the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. I just shared a lot of information about you, but what are some other things that maybe I left out? Or what is your role in shaping American education at this time?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Eric. I still think, the most important thing that I've done in education is teach. And I still think of myself primarily as a teacher. I taught for a number of years and kind of wrote on the side, and got active on social media. I just kind of built my way into, bigger and bigger publications. So if you're asking me to introduce myself to your audience, I think of myself as just kind of like a teacher, writer, soon to be more on the administrative side, so an administrative writer, but somebody who's in the work, in the field, doing the work of actually teaching children and writing about it on the side. I did for just this last year, I was writing full-time about education, and it just never felt sufficient. It never felt like enough. And I think some of the best insight on education comes from, again, the people in the fields doing the work. There's a role for policymakers and professors and full-time columnists and journalists and all that kind of stuff, but that just wasn't something that I wanted to do full-time. The best insights are going to come from the people who are there trialing and erroring what they're doing and writing about it for an audience, and kind of exposing their mistakes for all and what works for all, to kind of learn from that.
And teachers and administrators have the best stories too, right? So like you go to school every day, and I tell my wife certain things and she just says that can't be true, right? So you get to actually enjoy some of the stories and the human side of things that is different than, some policy wonk out there who's just saying we should do this or we shouldn't do that. Tell us a little bit about your book. You wrote this book, What's Wrong with Our Schools. What kind of led you to write it? What do you feel like is, for our listeners, what are they going to see in that book? What are they going to read? And is there also anything that you would maybe change now that it's been out there for a little bit?
So what led me to write the book was so many people asking me, well, what else should I read? They went to their teacher prep program and got a bunch of theory, and most of that theory kind of fell into two camps, either like progressive education, not politically, but influenced by John Dewey, going to let students pick all of their the books that they want to read. They're going to design their own discipline policies, totally student-led, or what's called critical pedagogy, which is much more, overtly activist and political, and was critical of these two philosophies of education in my writing on social media, if I ever went on podcasts. And I got all these messages like, well, okay, if I'm not going to read Paulo Freire or John Dewey or Henry Giroux, who should I be reading? And I didn't always have one good, concise answer. There are books and thinkers out there that are, theoretical, some are practical, but none kind of covered more of a traditional or classical approach to education in like an introductory manner. And so I figured maybe I should write that book. So the book opens with the sort of introducing competing philosophies of education and then goes through all of the research to show that more of a traditional approach, teachers upfront modeling and explaining new concepts, giving formal exams and essays, asking them to do a little bit of rote practice and memorize some things, that these are going to be the most effective ways for students to learn. So the book came about because I thought there needed to be an alternative, and also my publisher asked me to do it. If there was anything I would change, really, I think if I had leaned into politics a little more, it would have sold a bit better. If I had made it a little bit more practical, which is a different avenue to go with it, it also would have sold a bit better. But I'm happy with the book that I wrote. And it sometimes feels like writing your first book is just like, you got to do it, get it out of the way, kind of know what you're doing. And I have ideas for what I'll do for a second or third or fourth book. But I'm actually pretty happy with the product that came out. Maybe a shorter subheading or subtitle.
And to supplement your book, you are very active on social media. I love just seeing your tweets, and always thought-provoking. And, when we think about innovation in education, and that's what this podcast is about, and you've seen a lot of things, you've written about a lot of things, what do you feel like is maybe something that is not currently happening in American education that you think should happen, could happen, but that you look at and you're like, that really needs to be it? What would that be for you?
I'm going to question the question and argue that I don't really like the word innovation in education. I think it's something of a category error. We don't want to innovate past the family dinner. We don't want to innovate past reading to our sons and daughters at bedtime. Like, these are traditions and practices that have a lot of value. And if we try to innovate past that, then we kind of lose something important. And I think teaching, an adult explaining something to children is a pretty old-fashioned, traditional institution that we shouldn't really get rid of. And when we try to innovate past explaining new concepts, memorizing things, practicing the skill that we just learned, we actually get rid of a lot of valuable things. So if there's something I wish were happening in education, it's actually that we'd be looking back towards kind of old school practices a lot more and get rid of this idea that we need to innovate in education. Because I think anytime we try to innovate past like a traditional cycle of instruction where you teach kids something, you ask them to practice it, and then you test them to see if they learned it. Anytime we try to innovate past that cycle, it always ends up worse. It's never as good. Sure, that cycle's imperfect. People can do it poorly or well, but there's never been a better process to come along, I would argue.
So it's like the innovation really is fundamentals, right? The fundamentals of eating as a family every night, reading to your kids, being involved at school, right? Like that's interesting. I like that thought.
Yeah, and it's actually kind of innovative to suggest that we go back to the fundamentals.
All right. And here we are in 2024 saying that, which is frustrating and a unique commentary on our society.
I think one of the most interesting things going on right now, and what people are perceiving as kind of innovative, is classical education. That the idea that people are trying to make it more universal, and there are all of these think pieces in these magazines and newspapers, because just this idea that we're going to go back to an old school education, we're going to try and offer it to everybody, is counterintuitively kind of innovative and intriguing and interesting.
So I want to take that a little bit of a step further too, because one of the issues that you do tweet about a little bit is a major concern for superintendents, principals, teachers is student behavior, right? Like, we've got this issue of student behavior. And so over the last few years, one of the things that we've heard a lot of people say, well, it's the pandemic, right? Because kids are coming out from the pandemic and they don't know how to behave because of learning loss or whatever it would be. Or, some of these student behavior issues have been issues well before the pandemic, right? And so when you think about student behavior and superintendents or principals addressing these types of issues, what do you feel like American education is getting wrong, and what do we do? I mean, what are some things that schools can do, parents can do, helping address that and address the foundational issues?
And this is a good example where when we try to innovate past what works, we end up adopting things that don't work as well. Some sort of consequences or punishments have been essential for child rearing for all of time. I mean, it's the basics of human behavior. If you sanction and try to disincentivize behavior that you don't want, and you reward and encourage behavior that you do want, what you allow and permit, you kind of encourage and foster. So if we let kids get away with cheating, with turning things in late, with cussing out their teachers, what are they going to do? They're going to cheat, they're going to turn things in late, and they're going to cuss out their teachers. We cannot create such a utopian system where no child is ever going to misbehave. However you want to explain it, human beings are imperfect. So even if we put them in a utopian society, human beings are going to misbehave in some way. Kids are going to misbehave in some way. They're going to push the boundaries. It's what they do. So if we try to innovate past consequences, we end up with riotous and unruly school buildings, disorderly school buildings where kids can't learn. They're so focused on, Johnny and Timmy competing to make the best farting noise in the back of the class that they can't focus on the phonics lesson or Shakespeare or astronomy lesson or whatever it is that's going on. So all of these newer ideas, restorative justice, PBIS, SEL, I mean, they all have a place. Who doesn't have a conversation? I mean, what good teacher or administrator doesn't have a conversation with a kid after giving them a detention or suspension? What caring and loving adult doesn't try to teach kids how to behave well through, social and emotional learning? What adults or teacher doesn't reward good behavior in some way? All of these things, SEL, restorative justice, and PBIS have a place. But when we try to innovate past the basic idea that kids need consequences when they misbehave, that they need timeouts and lunch detentions, your behavior system, your discipline structure is going to be worse for it.
And you talk about, in some of your work, about high expectations, right? And I think that, like, to that point of if you have a high expectation that we're not going to do those things that are inappropriate, we're not going to see that behavior in our students. So, like, just tell me a little bit more about that, like how you see high expectations and where teachers and schools are missing the mark when it comes to that. Because we love to talk about high expectations and we love to talk about these things, but there's a disconnect sometimes in the practice of that in our schools.
I had a conversation or an encounter with an old principal of mine who loved to talk a great game about high expectations and would tell the whole school at assemblies that, we expect the best of you and we don't tolerate X, Y, and Z here. But I had a student run into my room and try to pick a fight with one of my students. So another kid ran into the room and tried to pick a fight with one of my students. And this student, this kid that ran into my room didn't face any consequences for it at all. So we can say we don't tolerate fighting at this school and talk about that all we want. But if you don't actually provide a consequence when a kid picks a fight, that means you actually do tolerate fighting at that school. You can say you have high expectations for homework and work completion, but if kids don't face any penalties for turning things in late or not doing the work at all, well, you don't actually have a high expectation of them. And often that comes from a place of what's the cliche, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Little Johnny can't get his homework done because X, Y, or Z, so we need to give him pass this time, next time. It ends up being every single time. Again, you can talk about having high expectations of kids, but if you don't actually have any kind of accountability for students, for their behavior, for their work, for their academic outcomes, well, then you don't have high expectations for them. You're just talking about it.
Yeah, and I think that happens kind of across the board. And so if we were to switch that gear to we got behaviors, then when we talk about specifically reading and math, and we have students that may be a grade level, 2 grade levels, 5 grade levels below what they're supposed to be, where are you seeing some of the disconnects when it comes to achievement in reading and math in our schools? Where are we missing the boat in American education on that one?
I mean, this is one where I would go kind of back to, I keep alluding to the idea of traditional instruction. I'm going to bring us to, are you familiar with the Project Follow-Through? It's the biggest, most expensive study that the Department of Education ever carried out. And it was something like 20 different instructional, and curricular approaches that they implemented in dozens and dozens of different schools, something like 100,000 students, millions and millions of dollars. And then they saw, which instructional theory, when implemented, was most effective. And direct instruction, this, teacher upfront lecturing to the kids, drilling and killing them, measuring them and testing them to see if it worked. It blew the rest of the approaches out of the water on basic skills, problem solving skills, and emotional, competency. So not just kind of like the basic, can you do 2 + 2 = 4? But when faced with new and difficult problems and also their ability to kind of regulate their emotions during the school day and we're facing difficulties, it was direct instruction. It wasn't even a competition. It just blew the other approaches out of the water. Problem-based learning, project-based learning, inquiry learning, all the rest of them, the most traditional approach worked. And when it comes to reading, we're kind of, in America right now, reckoning with the idea that we tried to move past phonics for generations, teaching kids their letter sound correspondence and asking them to practice and memorize these letter sound correspondences. And we're reckoning with the fact that trying to move past phonics didn't work, and generations of kids didn't learn to read because we taught them poorly. I think we need to do that with math. California and then lots of districts across the country are adopting kind of inquiry approaches to math, building thinking classrooms, and none of them work. I have this article at City Journal. I think it was Fundamental Miscalculation, if anybody wants to read more about that traditional approaches to teaching math, asking them to memorize their math facts, these things work. And we're trying to respond to bad reading scores and bad math scores by implementing ineffective instructional practices. And it's just, it's stepping on the rake. It's shooting ourselves in the foot. Pick your cliche.
When you talk about direct instruction, about 12 years ago, I worked as a social studies teacher, and I worked alongside a guy who did everything that you're not supposed to do in the current landscape, where he did the direct instruction, drill and kill. His kids came in and didn't make a peep every single day, and they just did book work the whole time, and then he'd teach them, and then they do book work, and at the end of the year when the state test came back, our principal pulled up the data, and his growth metric didn't have like a 1, 2, 3, or 4. It said infinity. Like it literally said infinity in the data portal, the actual state data portal. I saw it with my own eyes. And so she had to call the superintendent and say, I've never seen this before, but this teacher has an infinity growth metric on here. What do I do with it? Right. But he did all the things. So to your point, like I've seen that happen, and you're right. The fundamentals is really the most innovative thing that we do to be effective in American education right now.
If I can toot my own horn just a little bit. One year I had the highest reading growth scores in the school, and the same principal that I've complained about once already on this podcast was always trying to get me to try the latest thing or try the latest innovation. And it's like, I read classic books. I made the kids read silently. They wrote essays. I explicitly taught grammar. But for some reason, we're so obsessed with innovation that it makes a lot of people uncomfortable in education to just do, not even boring, because it's not boring if you do it well. Direct instruction done well can be incredibly engaging and funny. You work in anecdotes and stories and analogies and lots of call and response and knowledge checks and all of these kinds of things. But it makes people uncomfortable to just go back to the fundamentals and the basics, when in reality, lesson plans built on these basics of instruction, practice, testing are going to be the most effective and most engaging kind of learning experiences for kids.
So we need the Department of Education. Well, let me ask you this. I personally think that we need to get rid of the Department of Education.
Amen.
I don't see it's as far as a budget line, the United States government, it's pretty small compared to a lot of things like Health and Human Services, Department of Defense, things like that. But I don't think that there's really any value of us having the U.S. Department of Education. Now, a lot of people tell me that that's ridiculous, and I work in education. Why would we do that? But if you understand states' rights and you understand reserve powers and you understand that the U.S. government doesn't really control a whole lot with education, then I think you would agree with me. But that's another podcast, another conversation. Let me ask you this, because we're kind of running out of time. Thinking about this time where innovation is happening, whether we want to or not, with social media, cell phones, those things have obviously been around for a while. But Now we're into AI, and people are starting to use AI. I'm an administrator. I'm starting to use AI for different tasks. There's part of it that I love, part of it that I feel weird about. But what are your thoughts about AI? Should we be using it? Does it have a place? What are the pros? What are the cons? What's kind of your take as a writer as well, and just the ethics of some of it?
About a year ago, I paneled with the Harvard Kennedy School where I was something of an AI booster and have since done a 180 and now don't use it at all. At least in my writing, I don't like how it replaced many of my interpersonal interactions that I had with people. So when you write professionally or on the side, you kind of have a lot of other friends that are writers, and we all share drafts of articles with each other. I have a friend who's a PhD student. There's kind of always like a one-to-one where he'll send me something, I give him some feedback, and then I'll send him something, I'll give him some feedback. Short articles, longer policy journals, or for him, academic journal pieces. And it's a way that we stay in touch. I have old friends from college where I'll send him something to read, and sure, we get together and he gives me some feedback on whatever it is that I sent him, but really it's an excuse to stay in touch. And I found when I started using ChatGPT, I stopped relying on people and keeping in touch with people and interacting with people. And I think AI it replaces interpersonal interactions in a lot of ways. So a teacher, if they're looking for questions to put on a test, or they're teaching of mice and men for the first time, and they're like, I need some analysis questions or some essay questions, they're going to turn to the computer and type it in there instead of going down the hall to the veteran teacher and being like, hey, I know this was on the curriculum 15 years ago. I wasn't here 15 years ago, but you were. No old jokes here. But they're not going to go rely on the veteran teacher for those kinds of things. Students, I'm writing an article on cheating right now, and I spoke to some students for it. This probably isn't the best example, but back in the day, if you were looking to, copy your friend's homework, you might go over to their house and work on the project together or share some ideas there. And now they just type it into ChatGPT or send pictures to each other. And it's like AI in a lot of ways is replacing our interpersonal interactions. The more I learn about it, the less I use it. And that's my vanilla answer. If you want to get into my real opinion about AI, I think it's going to turn reading and writing into Latin and Greek, where it's kind of just this interest of this, well-educated few, but that's like 50 years, 100 years down the line, not a tomorrow kind of thing, assuming it doesn't destroy human civilization first.
There's a lot of thoughts that people have on it, but that's helpful it is interesting to hear your journey in that you're a booster and now you've done a 180 on that. And I think that's part of what technology is, right? I mean, I loved Facebook and then I deleted it from my phone because it's terrible, right? In some seasons of life. Great. Well, this has been such a great conversation, Daniel. I think as you start a new school year, what are some thoughts that you have as you start this new year as an AP? Like, what are you excited about? What are you optimistic about? What are you worried about? What are kind of some of your things as you're starting a new school year?
Well, this is my first year as an assistant principal, so it's a lot of apprehension. I was never the best teacher in the school, but I was a pretty good teacher. I kind of knew what I was doing. And this year, I feel like I'm going back to my first year teaching where it's just a trial by fire. Thankfully, I know the principal and the other assistant principal are very, very good at their job. So I'm kind of going to be learning from some of the best, but it's a lot of apprehension. I'm excited to learn more about the education sector too, kind of from the administrative side, because there's just so much about education that I think you don't know as a teacher. Having done policy work, I see how much there is in the policy realm, just writing laws and all of these different statutes that dictate how this and that different kind of thing happen that as a teacher you don't have to think about. But when I was doing policy work, it was a trial by fire. There's just all of this stuff that I didn't know. And then same thing as an administrator, facilities, finances, all that kind of stuff that I'm going to suddenly have to do and see how a school really functions and runs from a different angle. And I'm excited to kind of write about my journey there too, hopefully admitting my failures as much as my successes.
Well, it'll be interesting to have you back on maybe in about 9 months or so and to hear ways that you've maybe been humbled, but also been energized, encouraged, things like that in the ways that you're making a difference, because I know that you will be, and that you are a very bright guy, and you've already made great contributions to education, and that you'll continue to do so in this role.
There might be a frantic edge to my voice that time, as there's like a fire in the background that we're recording this, but happy to come back on anytime.
Well, and for our listeners, it's just kind of a little bit of a side note. Daniel and I were talking before we came on about our first conversation back in the spring, and I had to cut it short because there was a fight on the bus, and I had to go take care of it. And I said, Daniel, I'm so sorry, and had to run real quick. So we might, again, the roles may be reversed on that one later on in the year, which would be just fine. So, well, again, Daniel, thank you so much for being on today. We want to thank our listeners and hope that you enjoyed the show. Again, the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast exists to discuss innovative ideas that will help schools across the country to thrive. This podcast, again, is produced in collaboration with New Era superintendents. New Era is an expanding national network of leaders dedicated to doing whatever it takes to deliver proficiency in reading and math to all students. If you are interested in learning more about New Era, head over to newerasuperintendents.com. Again, this has been another episode of the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast, where we are innovating education, American education, one podcast at a time. Listeners, one of the things I want to say is, first of all, thank you for joining us for this great episode with Daniel Buck on the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. After listening to the podcast and thinking about some of the things that Daniel said, I was struck by how Daniel is willing to say things that not everybody's willing to say. And so it made me think about, for myself, what are the things that I need to be saying that are really beneficial for our schools and for our kids, and that are not helpful. And so I challenge our listeners today just to think a little bit about, what are the things that are going on in your schools or in your districts that people know it's not really good, but we still do it anyways, and nobody's willing to kind of stand up to it. And that may be something like school lunches. What are our kids getting in their school lunches that are not good for kids and are not good for student learning, but we need to stand up to it and we need to talk about it a little bit more? What is it about the posters in your school and what those posters are saying that not everybody is? We all know we don't agree with it, but we're not willing to say we're going to take that poster down, right? And so, for instance, there's a poster in a lot of schools that'll say you can do anything that you put your mind to. And, well, maybe. And I've talked about this in my book, The Crumbling Schoolhouse. Just because you put your mind to something doesn't necessarily mean you can make it happen. You have to be a little bit realistic too. So, I want our listeners to think about those things that maybe they need to speak on, to challenge, because our schools are going to thrive when we have people in these schools that are challenging ideas, that are challenging the status quo. One thing that I wanted to share with our listeners too is that I recently had a conversation with some students who were in sixth grade, and I was in my school cafeteria, and they came to me and they said, Dr. T, are we allowed to talk about politics? And I thought, you're asking me that question. And I said, absolutely. Why are you asking that question? And they said that in their elementary school, that their principal had told them they were not allowed to talk about politics. And that, I don't know the whole context of maybe why this principal may have told these students that they weren't allowed to talk about politics, but it made me concerned and sad that our students are being told they can't talk about politics. The last time I checked, the United States Constitution still has the First Amendment intact, and that you have freedom of speech. So even our sixth grade students who want to talk about who the next president of the United States might be have the right to do that. And so, really something that I really thought about, and I think that people need to understand, is that those types of things are happening in our schools. You have principals, school leaders who are telling kids that they're not allowed to talk about politics. And so how can our schools thrive if we are telling students those types of things? And so that's why people like Daniel Buck are so important, because I think they're challenging what is happening in our schools. He is being a thought leader when it comes to some of just the misguided, unhealthy patterns in our schools. I want to thank our listeners again for tuning in. I hope you had a really enjoyable time listening to Daniel. You can check out his book, What is Wrong with Our Schools. Really great read. Encourage you to do so. But thank you again for tuning in to the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast.